Lesson today is 1 Samuel. We're looking at chapters 21 through 26.
This guy's a book.
All right, thank you. That's a lot of material to cover, so we're going to focus on 24, verses 1 through 10, and 26, verses 1 through 12. Also, chapter 24, we're going to go through the whole chapter. The main people we're going to be looking at will be Saul and David, and the differences between the two and the examples we need to follow, or the things that we don't need to follow. 4 things we're going to be looking at: fear, jealousy, anger, and trust. And these are the characteristics that we have today in our lesson. Fear, jealousy, and anger we want to avoid, and trust we want to follow. Okay, just going through and a short review. Chapter 21, after David and Jonathan parted ways, Jonathan was telling David Saul was out to kill him, so David fled to Nob. When he got to Nob was a gathering of priests. It was a priest called Ahimelech, and David took bread, something to eat, and the sword of Goliath, and when he did that, he lied. He said that he was on a special mission, and he was not. He was fleeing from David because of fear. So this is one thing we want to look at. Fear causes us sometimes to what? Lie. So then what? Then he went to Achish, the king of Gath. He was a Philistine city. And the people said to Achish, "This is the guy that the ladies sang about, that he killed 10,000s of Philistines. And he's here to see you." And David caught the gist of this, so he pretended he was insane to get out of the problem that he would probably run into. So what did he do again? He had fear. Fear. You know, it was not too smart to go into enemy territory. Where was Goliath from? Gath, wasn't he? To go to Gath where he had killed Goliath. It doesn't make sense. So when we have fear, we make decisions that don't make sense. And we have to be careful when we start thinking, is this the right thing to do? Is this what God wants me to do? So then in chapter 22, David escaped to the cave of Adullam. And this was it is a large natural cave with a lot of big, large chambers with a lot of height. And this is where 400 men joined David, and so David became their captain. These were men that were in distress, discontented, they were in debt, and this was David's army. What a group of guys. So then David went to the land of Judah, and Saul heard that David was there. And Saul was also told that Ahimelech, the priest, had showed David favor. Now Doeg, which was Saul's chief herdsman, happened to be at Nob. So he told Saul where David was. And Saul believed that they conspired against him along with David, so he had Ahimelech and 85 priests that were there killed. Not only that, they wiped out the whole town of Nob. Because of what? Anger. Started with jealousy, didn't it? Started with jealousy and now it went into anger, and it caused him to do a very stupid thing. So we have to look at that and say, do I do stupid things because of jealousy or anger in my life? We have to stop and think before we do things. In chapter 23, David was told that the Philistines were fighting against Keilah and that they were robbing the threshing floor. And you know what David did then? He inquired of the Lord. So he's back to where he should have been, inquired of the Lord. Now that's an example to follow. Okay? And he asked the Lord, should I go and fight with them? And the Lord said, go. So David went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines. And he smote them with a great slaughter. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. So then what happened? Saul found out David was at Keilah, and David found out Saul knew where he was, so he inquired of the Lord again. So he's back on track. So what should I do? And the Lord told David that they would deliver him to Saul. And so he went to the land of Ziph. And so Saul sought after him every day, but God kept delivering him out of his hand. So David went from place to place, Saul going after him, and David ended up in the stronghold of En-Gedi. And this is a wilderness in Judah on the shore of the Dead Sea. It was a place of like springs, cliffs, caves, rocky ground. It was like an oasis. It not was, it is. It's the same thing. Hasn't changed. So now we come to chapter 24, and this is the focus of our lesson. We'll look at David's chants, his convictions, and his cry as we look at these verses. We're also going to look at Saul and his actions. What's going on? Okay, chapter 24, verse 1. We're not going to be flipping back and forth like it does in the book. We're just going to go straight down, okay? Verse 1, chapter 24. It came to pass when Saul returned from following the Philistines, that was told him, saying, behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. So Saul was temporarily interrupted in his pursuit against David because the Philistines had invaded the land of Israel. So Saul and his army stopped going after David, and they went to battle against the Philistines. So we see here God protecting David, because he was pretty well surrounded at that point. And I thought, how many times has God protected us and we don't even realize it? You know, sometimes things happen. We get a flat tire and we mumble and grumble, but maybe it was for a reason. Or the car won't start, and we mumble and grumble, but maybe it was for a reason. Or things come into our life and we grumble about it, but God has a good reason for it, so we have to be careful. Verse 2, then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of Israel and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. Now I want to talk about in Jedi. So Saul with 3,000 men go after David with his 400. 7-1, that's pretty good odds, isn't it? 7-1. And Saul subjected them to the wilderness of Engedi. Again, a place of wilderness, rocks, cliffs, waterfalls. And it was called the place of the wild goats because there were wild goats there and they had the ability to travel on these rocks and cliffs. So David went there to get away from Saul. And verse 3, and he came to the sheep goats. By the way, where was a cave. Saul went in to cover his feet, and David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. So the sheep goats were places that they use in the caves. In the side of the caves, there were several caves that were like chambers, and they'd go in there for shelter for their cattle and sheep and whatever. And this is the situation here. So, and the caves in that country are large enough to came, some of them, several hundred men. Those are big caves. And I don't know if you've ever been in a cave before, but sometimes it's dark in there when they turn off the lights. I mean, it's so dark you can't see the front of your hand or the back of your hand or whatever. So anyway, Saul went into the cave. Then what happened? Well, it's amazing how God works. Consider the situation here. In all the area of Engedi, God brings Saul, David's enemy, to the very cave where David was. Why did he do that? What was the purpose? There was a reason for it. Verse 4, and the men of David said unto him, behold, the day of which the Lord has said unto thee, behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand, for thou mayest do unto him as it shall be good unto thee. Then David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privately. Now, did God tell David that? No, he didn't. He never did tell David that. God never made a promise of delivering Saul to David's hand. So David opposed the men of taking this opportunity to kill Saul. So, we too have to be very careful when someone tells us something. We have to weigh it out. Is that true? Or is it contrary to what God says? Even counsel is good, but we have to weigh it out. Weigh it out. Because just because someone said something, that doesn't mean that's what God wants for us. The Bible says in a multitude of counselors there's safety. But still, weigh it out. What does God want from me? So David went to where Saul was sleeping, cut off a piece of his outer garment in a secret or quiet manner. Verse 5. And it came to pass afterwards that David's heart smote him because he had cut off Saul's skirt. Getting my mouth twisted here. Saul's skirt. What do we see here? David wasn't proud of what he did. And he said, hey, look what I did. Wasn't I brave? I went in there and I cut off his skirt. See? Looky. Did he do that? No. He wasn't proud of what he had done. So he showed two things, remorse and through this, humility. So David's heart troubled him because he had disfigured and cut off Saul's robe. So what do we see in David here? I see anyway a tender heart, not a heart of revenge or hatred, but an unforgiving. Not an unforgiving spirit, but a forgiving spirit, a forgiving heart. Verse 6, and he said unto his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth thine hand, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. So David's action did not depend on others, did he? Didn't depend on Saul, what he did. He did what was right. You know, how it didn't make any difference how foolishly Saul was acting, because he had been appointed king by God, and God was the only one that was going to take him out, being king. So David was not going to take matters into his own hands. David believed he had no right to do this. So what's the lesson for us? Is there one? Don't try and get ahead of what God wants to accomplish in our life. Don't get ahead. God will to do in God's timing. The other thing, do you think the men might have been angry with David? Put yourself in this position. Your enemy is chasing you. You have a chance to kill him, and you don't. So you've been traipsing across the countryside, you know. You had a chance to get rid of Saul and stop this. And David said, no. What do we learn from this? Do what's right. Just do what's right, and don't give in to the majority. You know, in this case, in today, it's not the majority. You give in to the minority. Doesn't matter. Just give in to the minority, because if you're raising a stink, give in to keep them quiet. That's what's happening today, and you can see the mess we're in. Verse 7, so David stayed his servants with these words and suffered them not to rise against Saul. But Saul rose up out of the cave and went his way. Romans 12:19 says, dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord. And this is what David is doing here. He's leaving it up to the Lord. He's not taking it into his own hands. So it was desire of David's men to kill Saul, but David was able to calm them down. So then Saul woke up and he left the cave. Verse 8. David also arose afterwards and went out of the cave and cried after Saul, saying, my Lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed himself. So David showed all respect to Saul as his king and master, bowing himself before him. Luke 6:27, it says, but I say unto you, love your enemies, do good to them that hate you. And this is exactly what David was doing. David said to Saul, wherefore hearest thou men's words, saying, behold, David seeketh thy hurt. So David had none, zip, evil motive, intent against Saul. Saul was motivated by his own jealousy. Jealousy can cause all kinds of problems, can it? And we can see what it did here. Jealousy turned into anger, hatred. Jealousy can destroy relationships. Think about it. Was David really a detriment to Saul? He was captain of the army, and he did a good job. He was a good musician. He calmed Saul. So they could have been best friends. But what happened? Because of jealousy, Saul became an enemy of David. Or I should say, David became an enemy of Saul. So Saul believed that others had caused him to believe that David was his enemy and was out to kill him. But it was jealousy on his own admission. Behold, this day thine eyes have seen, verse 10, behold, this day thine eyes have seen how the Lord hath delivered thee today into mine hand in the cave, and bid me kill thee. But mine eyes spared thee, and I said, I will not put forth my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Saul came out of the cave, and this is what David said to him. So David said to Saul, hey, God gave me the opportunity to kill you, but I didn't. I didn't, because you are my master. You are my king. And I am not going to do it. Then verse 11, he says, moreover, my father, see the skirt of thy robe in my hand, for that I cut it off, the skirt of thy robe, and killed thee not. Know thou, see, there is neither evil nor transgression in my hand, and I have not sinned against thee, yet thou huntest my soul to take it. So David speaks in testimony of respect and subjection to him as a father. Think about it. What kind of a father was Saul? And yet he respected him. Saul tried to kill his own son. And yet David respected him. Why? Because he was the king's, because he was God's anointed. David had no intention to kill him or harm him. Verse 12, the Lord judge between me and thee, and the Lord avenge me of thee, but my hand shall not be upon thee. In Judges chapter 11, verse 27, it says, wherefore I have not sinned against thee, but thou doest me wrong to war against me. The Lord be the judge this day between the children of Israel and the children of Ammon. The Amorites had no cause to make war against Israel when Israel went in to take the land, but they made war against them. And they had no cause to do it. And this is what this is talking about. So Saul had no cause to go against David. So we're talking about the same thing. So David is saying, let the Lord be the judge. I'm not going to be the judge. Let the Lord be the judge. So do we go against someone without cause? We shouldn't. David said he would not touch him, but leave it to God to do him right. And God did. Verse 13. As saith the proverb of the ancients, wickedness proceedeth from the wicked, but my hand shall not be upon thee. Verse 14, after whom is the king of Israel come out? After whom does he pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea? So what David is doing here is sort of indicating himself worthless, like a dead dog or a flea. Why would the king take all these men and go after me? Why would he do that? Doesn't make sense. Why would he take all that effort to go after him? And when you think about it, all that goes into what Saul was doing, 3,000 men going after David. Verse 15, that the Lord therefore be judge, and judge between me and thee, and see and plead my cause, and delivered me out of thine hand. In the Psalms, you read the Psalms, David said over and over and over, plead my cause. David must have had a lot of enemies. A lot of enemies, because through the Psalms he keeps going over this and over this. Example, Psalms 35:1, please my cause, O Lord, with them that strive with me, and fight against them that fight against me. Psalm 43:1, judge me, O God, and plead my cause against an ungodly nation. O deliver me from the deceitful and unjust man. Psalms 119, 154, plead my cause and deliver me and quicken me according to thy word. And over and over and over in the Psalms, David asked God to protect him from his enemies. So, verse 16, it came to pass when David had made an end of speaking these words unto Saul, that Saul said, is this thy voice, my son David? Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He wept. So we can see here, even the hardest heart can be broken. And Saul's tears acknowledged David's innocence and his own guilt. Unfortunately, it didn't last, did it? It didn't last. The reason I think it didn't last, because it wasn't from the heart. Words can say a lot, can't they? We can say anything. But if it's not from the heart, it doesn't mean much. It won't last. Verse 17, and he said to David, thou art more righteous than I, for thou hast rewarded me good, wherein as I have rewarded thee evil. So Saul admitted, didn't he? He admitted he had been unjust in his goings after David to kill him. David had opportunity to kill him, but instead he rewarded him with his life. Verse 18, and thou hast showed this day that thou hast dealt well with me, inasmuch as when the Lord had delivered me into thine hand, thou killest me not. In verse 19, for if a man find his enemy, will he let him go away? Wherefore the Lord reward thee good, for that thou hast done unto me this day. Verse 20, now behold, I know that thou shalt surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in thine hand. So now we see Saul is at the place where he confessed the favor of God toward David. But did he change? Did he stop going after him? So he went against his own conscience, didn't he? He went against what he knew was wrong. So his jealousy was eating him up. I mean, it was eating him up, and it was destroying him, and eventually it would destroy him. So we have to be so careful, because one thing leads to another. Jealousy, anger, holding a grudge will destroy us if we let it. You know, a lot of times a person that we have a grudge against don't even know it. They have no idea what's going on. A lot of times a lack of communication. Just a lack of communication creates all kinds of problems. Just communicate. Might not agree, but communicate. Verse 21. Swear now therefore unto me by the Lord that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me, and that thou wilt not destroy my name out of my father's house. So, what's happening here, you know, if we look back, he had sworn to his son Jonathan that David should not be slain. And yet he's seeking all means in his power to destroy him. In 1 Samuel 19, going back to 19 verse 6, Saul hearkened unto the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore that as David liveth, as the Lord liveth, David shall not be slain. So remember, Jonathan talked to him about David. He's done no wrong. What has he done? He has done nothing against you. So I won't have him slain. But he didn't hold true to his promise. So now Saul is asking David to save him and his family. Sometimes a new ruler would come to rule, and he'd wipe out the old king and the old family. I mean, all of them. Even the kings, some of the kings were wicked. It didn't matter if anyone was a threat to them, they'd wipe them out. Family or no family. Wife, kids, uncles, aunts. Didn't matter if somebody was against them, they'd wipe them out. And you'd wonder, wow, what kind of people are these? So now, Saul was asking David to save him and his family. And in verse 22, David swore unto Saul, and Saul went home. But David and his men got them up into the hold. So David agreed, didn't he? He did not destroy his family. But David stayed in the hold of En-Gedi. Why did he do this? Saul was pretty inconsistent, wasn't he? Could David trust Saul? No. He had frequent experience of Saul's. He didn't trust him. Trust comes from what? Truth, doesn't it? Trust comes from truth, not deception. If there's deception, it's going to be hard to trust somebody. Then we go into chapter 25. Chapter 25 deals with the death of Samuel and with Nabal and Abigail. And then we go to chapter 26, which is again the focus of your lesson. Chapter 26 and verse 1, it says, And the Ziphites came unto Saul in Gibeah and said, Doth not David hide himself in the hill of Hachilah, which is before Jessamine? And the Ziphites had before informed Saul of David's where he was in the past. In 1 Samuel 23:19, then came the Ziphites to Saul in Gibeah, saying, doth not David hide himself with us in the strongholds in the woods, in the hills of Hachilah, which is south of Jessamine? And then verse 2, what happens? Then Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph, having 3,000 chosen men of Israel with him to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. So what we see here, verse 2, he's still after him. We see the inconsistency and the faultness and the rage of Saul still going on. See, just a short time ago, he had been indebted to David for his life, acknowledged his own error, said I was wrong, and he swore that he'd be kind to his family, be kind to my family. Yet here, he declares himself an enemy again, seeks to take his life. So in verse 3, Saul pitched in the hills of Hachilah, which is before Jessamine, by the way, but David abode in the wilderness, and he saw that Saul came after him in the wilderness. So David found out Saul was coming after him, but he didn't run. He stayed where he was. So at this point, David had 600 men. So we're down to 5-1 now. But David was still depending on the Lord. Take care of him as he had done in the past. Remember, David slew the lion, the bear, Goliath. He escaped from Saul over and over and over again. So David has gone from fear to faith and trust in God. Verse 4. David therefore sent out spies and understood that Saul was in very deed. In other words, so David sent out spies to verify that Saul was after him and what his location was. And that's what we see. Verse 5. David arose and came to the place where Saul had pitched, and David beheld the place where Saul lay, and Abner the son of Ner, the captain of the host, and Saul lay in the trench, and the people pitched round about him. So they came to the area where Saul had pitched, or where they had made camp. They stopped and made camp. And Saul was in the middle. They call it the trench, but it was like a circle. The soldiers were around him. Saul was in the middle, and Abner was close to him. And verse 6 says, answered David and said to Ahimelech the Hittite, and to Abishai the son of Zeruiah, brother to Joab, saying, who will go down with me to Saul to the camp? And Abishai said, I will go. Think about that for a minute.
Yeah. How many men did Saul have around him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Verse 7. Excuse me. So David and Abishai came to the people by night, and behold, Saul lay sleeping within the trench, and his spear stuck in the ground at his bolster. But Abner and the people lay around about him. So this was a bold attempt for these men to come into the middle of in the middle where Saul was. So they had strong confidence in God. Strong confidence in God's promise that He would preserve them. It's a different David, isn't it? A different David. You know, we sometimes do that, don't we? We read about David being fearless, and we read about David being fearful, and David being fearless, and David being fearful. We do the same thing. Fearless to fearful. Trust to no trust. Verse 8. Then said Abishai to David, God hath delivered thine enemy into thine hand this day. Now therefore, let me smite him, I pray thee, with the spear even to the earth at once, and I will smite thee, not smite him the second time. So this is the second time that those with David had suggested, let's get rid of this guy. Let's have Saul killed. So David said, hey, you're right. We better do this now, right? Is that what he said? No. Verse 9, David said to Abishai, destroy him not, for who can stretch forth his hand against the anointed, God, the Lord's anointed, and be guiltless? And verse 10, David said furthermore, as the Lord liveth, the Lord shall smite him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall descend into battle and perish. In 1 Samuel 26, verse 11, the Lord forbid that I should stretch forth my hand against the Lord's anointed. But I pray thee, take now thy spear that is at thy bolster and cruse of water, and let us go. So David was sticking to his guns. So David took, verse 12, David took the spear and the cruse of water from Saul's bolster, and they got them away, and no man saw it, nor knew it, neither awake, for they were all asleep. Why? Because a deep sleep from the Lord was fallen upon them. So who's in charge? God's in charge. This was a miracle. Think about it. I mean, going into the center of the enemy, right next to the king, and God's got everybody sleeping, so nobody wakes, and yet David does not take Saul's life. So then in verses 13 through 20, David cried to the people of what was happening, and then verse 21 was Saul's response. Then said Saul, I have sinned. Return my son David, for I will no more do thee harm, because my soul was precious in thine eyes this day. Behold, I have played the fool, and have erred exceedingly. And then we skip to verse 25. Then Saul said to David, Blessed be thou, my son David. Thou shalt do great things, and shalt also prevail. Thou shalt prevail, still prevail. So David went on his way, and Saul returned to his place. So what did we learn through this lesson? We see fear, we see anger, we see jealousy, and we see trust, and how it affected the lives of those involved. Does this apply to us? Do we have a choice in these matters? When situations come into our lives, how are we going to handle it? Are we going to be full of fear, jealousy, anger? Do we go with our emotions, or do we trust God? It's up to us, isn't it? Choice, 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 choice. God gives us the strength to make the right choice. Any comments, thoughts? Yes?
What really stands out to me is anytime we try to make something happen, look at Abraham and Sarah. Abraham's told he's going to have a child, all these descendants, so he goes about to make that happen because God said it was going to be, and he made a mess that they're still paying for today. David was told, you were the anointed king, and so, he could have gone, he could have killed Saul and taken the throne, which would have started that whole process of killing off the next king so you can take over, like so many other countries, and still today with military coups and everything else. But he didn't. He actually waited for God to make his word happen, rather than making it happen, which is what we tend to want to do.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other comments? Robert, you're quiet. No comments?
Miracles still happen.
All right. Rob, would you close in prayer, please?
Father, as we come to your throne of grace, we just want to appreciate Marvin and the words that he delivered, that we open our hearts and our minds to. Father, be with Brother Bond as he brings your word, that we are receptive to it. And Father, also just thank you so much for the guests that are here and that they learn and go home and have a peace in their heart. Just thank you where we have. Forgive us where we have failed you. Forgive us our sin. In Jesus' name we pray.